There's someone, somewhere in your life, who irritates you more than they should. Not someone who's hurt you, not someone who threatens you directly, just someone whose single trait puts you in a state the situation, objectively, doesn't justify. A coworker, too sure of himself in a meeting, who speaks up without hesitation, who never seems to doubt the value of what he says. A friend who never stops talking about her wins, her latest trip, her promotion, her plans, without ever asking how you're doing. A stranger who politely refuses a request, without a trace of guilt in her voice, as if saying no were the most natural thing in the world, and you boil. You feel something disproportionate, a heat in your face, an urge to cut the conversation short, a ready-made phrase, rising almost against your will. Who does he think he is? She's really overdoing it. They're genuinely unbearable. People like that. You'd never say that about a stranger who trips on the street. You don't feel that intensity towards some random flaw. So why does this particular person, with this particular trait, trigger something this strong in you? You might tell yourself it's just a matter of personality, that some people annoy you, that's all, end of story. But if you honestly observe the pattern, you'll notice something unsettling. It's almost never random traits that irritate you. It's almost always the same kind of trait, in different people, in different contexts, years apart. That's not a coincidence. And it's not, as you'd like to believe, a question of the other person's character. It's a question that concerns you. A question Carl Jung asked with almost surgical precision over a century ago, watching this same pattern repeat itself in his patients, again and again. What if what you hate in someone else is nothing more than a piece of yourself, a piece you refuse to look at? Movement 1. The mechanism. Jung called it the shadow, not the shadow in a poetic sense, not some vague metaphor for inner darkness, not something necessarily evil or destructive. The shadow, in his theory, refers to something much more precise, and in a way, much more mundane. Everything you learned, since childhood, not to be. To understand this concept, you first need to understand what Jung believed about human nature at birth. Every child, in his view, is born with a full potential, a complete palette of possible traits: anger, tenderness, ambition, laziness, desire, cruelty, generosity, pride, humility. All of it coexists at the start, with no hierarchy, no judgment attached. The child doesn't yet know that some of these traits will be deemed acceptable and others not. All they know are their impulses. Then comes upbringing. Then come the looks from adults, the rewards, the punishments, the awkward silences that follow certain behaviors and not others. And very quickly, a sorting process begins, almost invisible because it's so gradual. Some traits are accepted, encouraged, praised, folded into the image you have of yourself. You're told you're kind, so you learn to be kind, over and over, until it becomes a given about who you are. You're told you're serious, diligent, reasonable, and these words become part of your conscious identity. Other traits, on the other hand, are rejected because they triggered a negative reaction once, or several times, or systematically. The anger that made your mother cry. The desire for possession that got labeled selfishness. The ambition that got mocked as arrogance. The laziness that got punished as a moral failing. These rejected traits don't disappear. This is the crucial point, the one most people miss the first time they hear this theory. They don't just evaporate because you stopped showing them in public. They retreat into a zone Jung calls the personal unconscious, and they keep existing there, active, waiting, like energy with nowhere to go. That's the shadow, the part of you that you learned to stop recognizing as yours, but that never stopped existing. And here's the central point of the whole theory, the one that explains precisely your disproportionate irritation toward certain people. What you've repressed in yourself never fully disappears from your perception of the world. It resurfaces, but projected outward, onto others, in an unrecognizable form, the form of moral judgment. The mechanism is almost mechanical, precisely, almost predictable once you know it. You come across someone who openly expresses, with no apparent restraint, a trait you yourself have buried for a long time. This person carries no censorship on this particular point. They live out this trait without shame, without hesitation, sometimes even with pride. And this absence of censorship hits you directly. It strikes something in you, because it wakes up, without you realizing it, the part of you that you spent years silencing. Your irritation, in this context, is therefore not an objective judgment of the other person, even if it feels that way in the moment. It's an internal alarm signal, misread, that actually says something like this: here's what I forbade myself from being, and here's someone who doesn't forbid it, right in front of me, without paying the price I imagined was unavoidable. Take this very common example. A man who harshly judges selfish people, those who talk about themselves without hesitation, who set boundaries without apologizing, who decline a request without justifying it for 10 minutes. This judgment sounds moral, almost virtuous, almost a sign of good upbringing. But if this man grew up learning that thinking of himself was a fault, that asking for something for himself was an unforgivable lack of generosity, then this judgment says something else, something far more intimate. It says he too would like to think of himself without guilt, that he'd like to set a boundary without apologizing 15 times beforehand, and that he simply doesn't allow himself to. The other person isn't the problem in this story. The other person is a mirror, an involuntary mirror, and this mirror reflects back an image you'd rather, deep down, never have to look at. What makes this mechanism particularly powerful is how completely invisible it is at the moment it happens. No one consciously tells themselves, while watching someone who annoys them, well, look, there's my own shadow surfacing. The mind does exactly the opposite. It externalizes immediately. It turns an internal discomfort into a judgment about the outside world, because it's infinitely less painful to judge someone else than to recognize a part of yourself you've spent a lifetime trying to forget. There's a simple test, almost crude in its simplicity, that Jung himself suggested for telling a well-founded judgment apart from a shadow projection: the intensity of the emotional reaction. A real flaw, observed in someone, generally produces a proportionate reaction, sometimes even plain indifference. You note the flaw, you factor it in, and you move on without thinking about it hours later. Projection, on the other hand, leaves a trace. It keeps occupying your mind long after the scene. You replay it that evening, you bring it up to someone close, you rehearse sharper comebacks in your head that you could have said in the moment. This persistence, this rumination, is itself a clue. It's no longer the other person occupying your mind. It's something in yourself that got touched, and that keeps vibrating well after the encounter. There's also a second characteristic signature of projection: the difficulty of naming exactly what's bothering you. Faced with a real, objective flaw, you can usually explain it precisely in just a few words. Faced with a projection, the explanation becomes strangely vague, circular, loaded with emotion disproportionate to the words themselves. He annoys me. I don't know. There's just something about him. This vagueness, this difficulty putting precise words to an otherwise intense irritation, almost always betrays something coming from within rather than from outside. There's another example, just as revealing, that touches on a different register: sensuality and openly owned pleasure. A woman who feels uncomfortable, almost scandalized, watching another woman speak freely about her body, her pleasure, her relationship to seduction, without the slightest visible embarrassment, can feel an irritation that goes far beyond a simple disagreement over values. If this discomfort comes packaged with a quick moral judgment, She has no modesty. That's just not proper. It's worth asking what that modesty, enshrined as a virtue since childhood, actually cost. How much pleasure, how much bodily freedom, how much simply lived desire was sacrificed to maintain that image of propriety. Movement 2. The origin. To understand why this mechanism takes hold with such force, and why it becomes almost automatic in adulthood, you have to go back to a specific moment, or rather, to an accumulation of specific moments. The one where, as a child, you understood for the first time that some part of you wasn't welcome. This moment almost never looks like an isolated, spectacular, easily identifiable trauma. It's much more often an accumulation of micro-signals, repeated, nearly invisible to an adult observer, but perfectly recorded by a child who is above all, biologically, seeking to stay safe and stay loved. A child who expresses anger, who yells, who stamps their feet, and who gets told, "You don't talk to your mother like that," learns, without anyone explicitly spelling out the lesson, that anger puts love at risk. They don't need to be told in those exact words. The tone, the look, the silence that follows are more than enough to carve the lesson in. A child who cries, who expresses deep sadness, and who gets told, "Stop it, it's nothing, it's not a big deal," learns that their sadness is a burden, that it needs to be minimized to be tolerated by the adults around them. They learn to minimize it themselves, before anyone else even needs to do it for them. A child who states a desire, who says, "I want that, I want more, I want to be first," and who gets answered with, "You're too greedy, too demanding, calm down a little," learns that wanting, plainly, openly, without detour, is suspect, almost a character flaw. This process has a precise name in Jungian theory: the construction of the persona. The persona is the social mask, the adjusted version of yourself, the one acceptable in others' eyes, the one that guarantees love and belonging to the group. It isn't inherently bad. This needs to be stressed. It's even absolutely necessary. It allows you to live in society without imposing every raw impulse, every immediate desire, on the people around you. Without a persona, no social life would be possible. The problem, then, isn't the persona itself. The problem arises when the persona becomes the entirety of what you believe yourself to be, when, over time, you forget it's only a functional facade, useful but partial, and you start to sincerely believe it's your whole identity, without remainder, without exception. At that exact moment, everything that doesn't fit inside this facade, anger, desire, raw ambition, jealousy, the selfishness sometimes necessary for psychic survival, becomes foreign to you. It's no longer, in your mind, a part of me I choose not to show right now, in this particular context. It has literally become something that isn't me, that doesn't belong to me, that belongs to other people, of lesser moral quality. And it's precisely this part, made foreign through repetition, that Jung calls the shadow. What's particularly troubling about this theory is that this process almost never needs to be violent to be effective. It doesn't require abuse, or serious neglect, or an obvious trauma to produce a solid, lasting shadow. A genuinely loving, well-meaning upbringing that simply and consistently favors certain traits over others is more than enough to build a robust shadow. Families described as too nice often produce, paradoxically, shadows full of repressed anger, because anger was never allowed to exist openly in that household. Highly ambitious families, very demanding about academic or professional success, produce shadows full of shameful laziness, of a never-acknowledged desire for rest. Very modest, reserved families, uncomfortable discussing the body or desire, produce shadows saturated with unadmitted sexuality, with repressed curiosity. Each family configuration shapes its own shadow, specific, custom-made, unique to that particular history, and this is precisely why two people never hate exactly the same traits in others, with the same intensity, in the same circumstances. What you hate reveals, with an almost embarrassing precision when you really think about it, what your particular, unique history taught you to reject in yourself. There's also a more subtle phenomenon that Jung observed in many patients. The shadow doesn't only contain negative traits in the ordinary moral sense. It can also contain qualities, talents, potentials that the child learned to hide because they disturbed the family's balance. A particularly bright child, in a family where modesty was overvalued, may repress their own intelligence out of fear of hurting or overshadowing others. That part too becomes shadow, a golden shadow, as some of Jung's followers later called it, and it gets projected the same way, but in the form of excessive admiration, almost obsession, toward those who openly embody that repressed potential. You also have to understand that this process never really stops at childhood itself. Adolescence often replays the same scenario, with new actors. The peer group becomes, at this stage of life, a tribunal almost as powerful as the family, sometimes more so. A teenager who expresses a passion their group deems uncool, an enthusiasm that's too visible, an artistic sensitivity perceived as excessive, learns once again to fold that part of themselves away, to bury it even deeper, in order to keep belonging to the group. Each stage of life thus adds new layers to the shadow, built on top of the layers already laid down in childhood. And there's one last dimension to this origin, often overlooked: the cultural shadow. Beyond family and peer group, every society values certain traits and condemns others, on a larger scale. Cultures that value collective humility produce shadows full of repressed individual pride. Cultures that value individual performance produce shadows full of never acknowledged needs for dependence and rest. What you hate in others, then, isn't purely the product of your personal family history. It's also, in part, the product of a collective repression shared across an entire generation, an entire culture, which explains why certain moral judgments cut across whole societies with remarkably uniform intensity. Take a moment to picture a specific, almost ordinary scene that illustrates this whole mechanism at once. A 7-year-old girl comes home from school, bursting with excitement because she won a drawing contest in front of the whole class. She runs to her mother, wanting to recount every detail, wanting to be praised, wanting someone to marvel with her. And her mother, tired, preoccupied with other worries that day, answers in a slightly annoyed tone, "Okay, that's nice, but don't brag too much. It's not becoming." This sentence, seemingly harmless, said without any intention to hurt, without even really thinking about it, still leaves a deep mark. The little girl doesn't hear, "My mother was tired that day." She hears, "My joy is a burden, my pride is a burden, I need to contain it in order to be loved." And this lesson, repeated one way or another over the following years, becomes a solid internal rule. Never show too much pride, never take up too much space with your own achievements. 20 years later, this same person, now an adult, feels an almost visceral irritation toward coworkers who openly share their successes on professional networks, who celebrate a promotion or a finished project without holding back. She probably no longer remembers the scene from the drawing contest. She may have even forgotten she loved to draw, but the rule remains intact, active, invisible, and it's precisely this internalized rule that quietly activates every time she meets someone who never received, or simply outgrew, that same prohibition. Movement 3. The manifestations. This mechanism never stays confined to a single area of your life, isolated from the rest. It shows up, in different forms, adapted to each context, everywhere you're in relationship with other human beings. In romantic relationships, first, where the intensity of projection often reaches its peak. This may be the sphere where this phenomenon plays out most forcefully, because romantic intimacy lowers all the usual defenses, all the social filters you maintain elsewhere. How many couple fights, seemingly triggered by some trivial detail, unwashed dishes, a poorly chosen word, a slightly sharp tone, actually conceal a projection far older, far deeper than the present situation. One partner accuses the other of being too cold, too distant, while they themselves have forbidden any authentic vulnerability since childhood, projecting onto their spouse the coldness they refuse to see in themselves. One partner accuses the other of being possessive, suffocating, when it's precisely them who suppresses their own need for emotional security, who never dares ask to be reassured, to be given attention, out of fear of appearing weak or dependent. The other person becomes the screen onto which, again and again, gets projected what one absolutely refuses to name in themselves. At work, next, where the mechanism takes on a slightly different color, more competitive, more tied to social recognition. The overly ambitious coworker, the one who triggers your contempt every time they speak up in a meeting, may simply be someone who dares to do what you don't allow yourself to do. Ask for a raise without beating around the bush. Decline a task deemed unfair without justifying it for an hour. Say no to a boss without fearing imagined consequences. Your contempt, in this specific case, isn't an objective moral evaluation of their behavior. It's envy, disguised as judgment, exactly as Nietzsche described with the concept of ressentiment, the transformation of an inner lack into moral condemnation of the person who has what you don't dare grant yourself. This same mechanism also shows up in how people judge those who visibly, publicly, unmistakably succeed. He doesn't deserve that success. She must have cheated somewhere. It's just luck. These phrases, repeated almost automatically in the face of someone else's achievement, deserve close examination. Does this judgment actually rest on verifiable facts? Or is it simply more comfortable to dismiss the other person's success than to admit the ambition, left buried, that you yourself carry without ever daring to nurture it? With strangers too, projection strikes, sometimes even more sharply and immediately, because there's no relational restraint to soften it, no shared history to nuance the judgment. That stranger you cross paths with in a cafe, who speaks loudly, who laughs without worrying about others' opinions, who seems perfectly at ease in her own presence, taking up space without excuse or justification. Why can this perfectly ordinary scene trigger disproportionate annoyance in you? Because she embodies, without knowing it, without even knowing you, a freedom you forbade yourself long ago, the freedom to exist without constantly monitoring the effect you have on others, without calculating every gesture, every word, based on the judgment you fear from them. In friendships too, this mechanism operates, often more insidiously than in other spheres, because friendship supposedly rests on mutual acceptance, on an assumed absence of judgment. And yet, how many friendships slowly crack because of an irritation never named, never openly discussed, growing silently until it becomes a cold, unexplained distance? That friend who overdoes it in her stories, who systematically takes over the conversation with her own tales, sometimes triggers an annoyance far beyond the actual inconvenience of the situation. If you learn to always let others go first, to downplay your own stories out of fear of seeming self-centered, then this friend becomes the exact mirror of what you forbid yourself, taking up space in conversation without apologizing. And finally, the most painful manifestation of all, the quietest, the hardest to spot, because it never passes through another person's face, projection turned toward yourself. The shadow mechanism doesn't always stop at the outside, at third parties. Sometimes it turns inward, and you become your own object of contempt, your own target. That fierce self-criticism, that inner voice calling you weak, selfish, mediocre, a failure at the slightest mistake. This voice, very often, is simply repeating, sometimes word for word, what the people around you taught you to condemn in yourself, long ago, without ever letting you make peace with those traits you still carry, somewhere, buried, still alive. Without realizing it, you've become the guardian of your own shadow, the one who watches it and punishes it in place of the adults from before. There's also a collective manifestation of this mechanism on a scale larger than individual relationships, one that plays out in groups, communities, sometimes entire nations. A group that condemns with particular vehemence a behavior in a rival group, lack of discipline, excessive pride, supposed permissiveness, often reveals, through the sheer intensity of that condemnation, a repressed part of its own collective identity. Jung himself took an interest in this phenomenon at a historical scale, observing how entire societies project onto an outside group what they refuse to recognize in themselves. This collective dimension partly explains why certain conflicts between groups seem so disproportionate compared to the actual differences separating them. The hatred directed at the other group is often, in reality, hatred directed at a part of oneself one absolutely refuses to admit to. There's also a more everyday, more discreet manifestation than all the previous ones, the one that plays out toward children, especially one's own. A parent who gets disproportionately irritated at their child's insolence, at their mess, at their refusal to obey, sometimes unknowingly relives the exact same scene they themselves experienced years earlier, from the child's side this time. A parent's anger toward a disobedient child can, in reality, be anger never expressed toward their own parents, stuck for decades, finally finding, through a cruel detour, somewhere to discharge itself. What makes this phenomenon particularly hard to spot, in all its manifestations, is its complete invisibility from the inside. No one consciously tells themselves, in the moment, I'm projecting my shadow onto this person, right now. The judgment always feels perfectly legitimate, perfectly grounded in objective, verifiable facts. It's precisely this sense of absolute legitimacy, this unshakable conviction of being right, that should raise a flag, because a genuinely proportionate reaction to a real situation generally doesn't need to justify itself with this much internal force. Movement 4. The turn. At this point, it would be tempting to conclude that the solution is to eliminate this shadow once and for all, to fight it head-on, to dissolve it through willpower, to finally become someone who never again feels this disproportionate irritation toward others. But Jung proposes exactly the opposite of this approach, and this is precisely where his theory gains its full depth, well beyond the simple psychological observation just laid out. For Jung, the goal is never to eliminate the shadow, to destroy it, to get rid of it, like some cumbersome waste. It's even, in his view, both impossible and dangerous to try such a thing. A part of you rejected with violence never actually disappears. It grows stronger instead, becomes more uncontrollable, more likely to resurface abruptly, sometimes destructively, precisely because it was never acknowledged, never named, never welcomed as a legitimate part of you. What Jung proposes instead is called integration, recognizing that this part genuinely exists in you, that it has always belonged to you, without giving it total, unchecked power over your everyday actions. This process has a precise name in his work, a name that became central to all of analytical psychology: individuation. It's the path, long and never fully complete, by which a person becomes a coherent whole, progressively integrating what they rejected of themselves over the years, rather than continuing to live split in two. On one side, the presentable, polished, acceptable persona, and on the other, the disowned, shameful shadow, kept at a distance. Concretely, this absolutely does not mean becoming this part of yourself without any restraint, without any discernment. Recognizing your repressed anger doesn't mean becoming violent toward the people around you. Recognizing your repressed ambition doesn't mean crushing others to succeed at any cost. Integration isn't a license to act without limits. It's simply knowing that this energy exists in you, being able to name it clearly when it shows up, and therefore no longer being entirely governed by it without knowing, without understanding where it actually comes from. And here's the most interesting paradox in this whole theory, the one that turns a simple psychological observation into a genuine tool for self-knowledge. It's precisely your ability to spot your disproportionate irritations that becomes, once understood and accepted, a source of information about yourself. Every person who annoys you beyond reason shows you, like a detailed map, a part of your shadow still not integrated, still active, still waiting to be acknowledged. This isn't an invitation to become indiscriminately lenient toward everyone, or to excuse others' genuinely harmful or dangerous behavior. There obviously are toxic behaviors, real injustices, situations where judgment is perfectly well-founded and necessary. It's a more modest but deeper invitation to ask yourself, every time an irritation seems disproportionate to the actual facts, what is this person doing, without apparent hesitation, that I've firmly forbidden myself from doing for a long time? This question, asked honestly, without self-indulgence, but also without excessive harshness toward yourself, completely changes the nature of the initial judgment. It's no longer about condemning the other person, reducing them to a flaw. It's about turning back toward yourself, with curiosity rather than shame, to understand what you set aside, long ago, without even realizing it at the time. There's also another dimension of this integration worth mentioning, the golden shadow mentioned earlier, those repressed qualities rather than repressed flaws. Noticing the people you admire almost excessively, almost disproportionately as well, can reveal the same thing, but in reverse. A potential you carry within you, but that you've never dared to fully inhabit, out of fear of disturbing others, out of fear of taking up too much space, out of fear of exceeding what your history allowed you to become. This integration work is never instant, and Jung insisted particularly on this point. It's not a single moment of awareness, a click that resolves everything at once. It's a continuous, repeated, almost daily dialogue between the conscious part of yourself and this shadow that regularly resurfaces in ever new forms, in front of ever different people. Every disproportionate irritation becomes, from this perspective, a renewed opportunity to resume this dialogue, rather than a problem to be permanently eliminated. There's also something deeply liberating in this approach, once you've truly understood it, and not merely heard it intellectually. The weight of constantly judging others, this ongoing vigilance toward everything that bothers you, lightens considerably once you understand that this judgment was never really about the other person in the first place. You can then watch someone who, in the past, would have triggered immediate irritation with a new kind of curiosity, almost quiet gratitude, not because their behavior suddenly becomes admirable, but because it becomes valuable information about yourself, rather than a threat to fight. Come back to that person, somewhere in your life, who irritates you more than they should. That coworker too sure of himself, who speaks up without ever doubting. That friend who never stops talking about her wins, without ever asking how you're doing. That stranger who refuses without guilt, as if saying no were the most natural thing. Look once more at what they're doing, without the automatic filter of immediate judgment, and ask yourself, simply, without judging yourself for the question, what you've forbidden yourself for so long that you've completely forgotten it, mistaking it for your true nature. This isn't an exercise you do once, in a passing moment of clarity. then close like a finished book. It's a question to ask again and again, every time an irritation feels a little too intense for the situation that triggers it. Every person who annoys you beyond reason is, in that sense, holding a piece of information about yourself you haven't yet received. Maybe they're not the problem. Maybe they're the ones showing you, without meaning to, without knowing it, the part of you you've never had permission to look at directly.